there's a lot of candidates in the race right now, so I think it'll be an uphill climb for everybody.
I think it's really important to win because we've seen the disastrous consequences of losing.
What does a large GOP field mean for the president?
As NATO allies, we're working together to help provide the collective defense.
If Donald Trump wasn't Donald Trump and wasn't a candidate for president, the Department of Justice wouldn't care.
Hello, I'm Nancy Cordes in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. President Biden and UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak met at the White House Thursday, vowing to work together on key issues. During a joint press conference, the leaders reiterated their support for Ukraine. They also unveiled plans for a new economic partnership between the two nations. This is Sunak's first visit to the White House since becoming prime minister. For more on this and a lot more, Ed O'Keefe and Nicole Killian join us now. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Nicole is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Welcome to you both. Okay, Ed, I'll start with you. An economic partnership between the U.S. and the U.K. What does that look like, particularly when you're talking about a post-Brexit Great Britain?
Yeah, well, it's not a big free trade deal, which is what Prime Minister Sunak was seeking, what Prime Minister Johnson was seeking before him, but what they're not getting from the Biden administration. Instead, it's a series of big words and long pages of discussion on things like combating AI or figuring out how exactly to do to make use of it in better ways than the potentially nefarious ones over the next several years. Civil nuclear agreements, working together on mining minerals or making sure that there's enough of them for the advancement and the development of batteries and other technologies that are needed. But for two countries that already do a lot of work together, any hope of a bigger trade agreement after the UK left the EU is not happening. And once again, a British prime minister is leaving the White House today empty-handed. But the two of them stress that on Ukraine, on other national security and intelligence issues, and on dealing with new and 21st century emerging threats, they're going to be working in lockstep. The thing to keep in mind, however, is at some point in the next year or two, the British are set to have elections, and it's very likely that the Tories will get knocked out and it will no longer be Prime Minister Sunak. I think the White House keeps that in mind, knowing that there very well could be a Labour government coming their way at some point.
Yep. Interesting, Ed. And the geopolitics. The president was also asked in this 2-and-2 press conference with the prime minister about LGBTQ plus issues, and he really came out swinging at Republicans. Let's take a listen to that.
Our fight is far, far from over because we have some hysterical and, I would argue, prejudice people who are engaged in all what you see going on around the country. It's an appeal to fear. And it's an appeal that is totally, thoroughly unjustified and ugly.
Hysterical, he called it, Ed. This comes the same day we learned that the administration is going to be appointing an anti-book banning coordinator. What's the message they're trying to send here?
Yeah, here's another example of the White House dealing with, in essence, an emerging issue, or some would say an emerging threat, and that is the threat to free speech and to LGBTQ rights across the country. An unnamed but set to be appointed education department official who will sort of tackle the issue of book banning. They point out that hundreds of titles, many of them having to do with gay rights or transgender issues, have been banned thousands of times across the country. There's also plans for the Justice Department and Homeland Security to work together a little more closely on threats of violence against the gay, lesbian, transgender community here in the United States. All of it, of course, coming at the beginning of Pride Month. There was set to be a massive Pride Month event here at the White House tonight with more than 2,000 invited guests, the largest the White House has ever hosted. They've postponed that until Saturday evening now because of the smoke all across the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. But, an example of the White House tackling an issue that has become a big concern for a lot of Americans who are on either side of the issue. But in the White House's case, certainly they're on the side of gay rights and of free expression and of making sure that book banning that has been enacted by Republican-led legislatures and school districts and cities is done away with as much as possible.
Nicole, I want to ask you about an ongoing piece of drama on Capitol Hill. Everyone marveled last month when Speaker Kevin McCarthy was able to keep his Republican conference together to broker a debt deal with the White House. But now that togetherness appears to be unraveling and everything in the House has ground to a halt because of it. Please explain what is going on, how we got here.
Yeah, that's right. There was so much momentum leading up to that debt ceiling vote. And while we knew there were a number of conservative Republicans who weren't on board, now that that vote has taken place, they have expressed some serious concerns about how those negotiations have been handled, so much so that they have effectively stalled the GOP agenda. You know, this week the House was set to vote on 2 measures that would ban or prevent a ban on gas stoves. This was supposed to be a party messaging bill. And we saw earlier this week a small group of Republicans from the House Freedom Caucus actually block this rule. The first time in 20 years something like this has happened. And so because of that, the Republicans haven't been able to move any type of legislation on the floor. So there have been ongoing discussions between this conservative faction of Republicans and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. I asked the Speaker this week if he felt blindsided by what happened. Take a listen.
People, like any family, have differences of opinion, and it's a time after the last big vote to get together and talk. And it's only healthy that you talk through it. Look, I always think tension only makes you stronger. Conflict makes you stronger if you deal with it. If you avoid it, it will perpetuate and become a bigger problem. Do I want to have this? No, but I'm not afraid of it.
Now, what he also explained is that he felt that some of this started between a misunderstanding between Majority Leader Scalise and Congressman Andrew Clyde, who has been pressing for another resolution to be advanced on the House floor dealing with pistol braces. So the Speaker suggested that it started with some type of misunderstanding between the two of them, that then bellowed out into this larger impasse with members of the House Freedom Caucus. I would note that that pistol brace measure is expected to be taken up next week in the Rules Committee, which suggests that House Republicans will try to get their agenda back next week. Interestingly, I would note that I talked to a more moderate Republican earlier today, Congressman Don Bacon, who basically said, look, we don't know what's going on. We've just been told to show up on Monday. And so there are many Republicans out there who are simply just hoping for the best and hoping that these two sides can resolve their differences.
Some tension between the House Speaker and his number 2, Steve Scalise, now spilling out into the open. We'll see what happens here. Ed O'Keefe and Nicole Killian, thank you so much. The GOP presidential field grew substantially this week, with multiple Republicans jumping into the race. Former Vice President Mike Pence, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum all launched their campaigns this week. CBS News political director Finn Gomez joins us now. Finn, welcome. What a busy week. And yet you have some breaking news on at least one other candidate who might jump into the race soon. What can you tell us?
That's right, Nancy. Sources close to former Texas Republican Congressman Will Hurd tell CBS News that he is nearing a decision on 2024. Hurd, the former CIA clandestine officer, has been seriously considering a run for the last couple of months. I spoke to him in Iowa just last month, and we could be seeing another candidate jumping to the race in the near future. Also, of course, there is another candidate that we should be potential candidate that we should mention, and that is the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez. Francis Suarez has been open about saying that he is also considering his own run. I also just spoke to a senior GOP source who says that he is moving in that direction of also his own entry. He has been investing in a super PAC, funds into a super PAC, and some of his city hall staffers have also moved to a political operation. So we could be seeing a decision with that mayor as well.
So clearly these two think there might be room for them in the race as well. And yet overshadowing everything is the possibility of a second indictment of former President Donald Trump, this time over his handling of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. What would that mean for the race? Would it hurt him? It didn't seem to hurt him a lot the first time he got indicted.
That is true. I've been speaking to sources close to sources from the other rival campaigns and camps who tell me that the former president, if you look at the Manhattan DA case, for example, his ratings, his poll numbers boosted him right after that happened. This is a little more serious, obviously. This is a federal case. It could be potential federal indictments. And they believe that in the long run, as the cycle continues, it could wound him to the point that it can potentially knock him off that podium, if you will, of being the front runner. They expect there to be some space there, but again, if you look at the nearest polls, the most recent polls, he's been up by double digits,
right.
Wide margins, in some cases 30 to 20 points.
So these are not the only two legal issues he's facing.
No.
A lot of challenges ahead of him. All right, Finn Gomez, political director, thanks so much for bringing us the breaking news. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Nancy.
Later in the half hour, I'm going to speak with Texas Democratic Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, who is also the Biden campaign's 2024 co-chair. Religious broadcaster and one-time presidential candidate Pat Robertson has died at the age of 93. The longtime TV host founded the Christian Broadcasting Network in 1960 and used the platform to promote conservative Christian values. Robertson launched a Republican presidential bid in 1988, ultimately losing that nomination to George H.W. Bush. He died at his home in Virginia early Thursday. No cause was given for his death. Millions of Americans are still under air quality alerts as smoke from Canada's wildfires continue to drift south. President Biden's climate advisor joins us next to discuss the government's response to these dangerous conditions. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The East Coast has been engulfed with smoke over the past few days, all stemming from a string of wildfires in Canada. The Air Quality Index says the air here in the nation's capital remains in the very unhealthy range. You can smell the smoke in the air. White House National Climate Advisor Ali Zaidi joins us now. Ali, thank you so much for being with us. Normally you'd be out on the North Lawn, but it's not safe to be outside for a lot of people, and that's why most of us are trying to stay indoors today. So what is your biggest concern when it comes to the smoke that's been blanketing parts of the East Coast?
Well, first of all, good to be on with you. This is an important issue, and I think the first thing we can do right away is attack the fire where it's burning. That's why the president has dispatched both aerial and ground support through the National Interagency Fire Center to make sure that we're standing shoulder to shoulder with our partners in Canada to tackle the wildfires where they burn. The second big thing that we can do is make sure we're looking after our neighbors, the most vulnerable among us. And to do that, we need to have science and data at our fingertips. That's why through the EPA, we have launched airnow.gov, which provides real-time information so that folks can stay abreast of the developments and protect themselves, whether it's by staying indoors or putting on a mask and looking after our neighbors as well. The third thing we can do is get after the root cause. We've got the fingerprints of climate change all over crises like this. And the only way that we avoid this becoming even more severe and even more frequent is by tackling the root cause.
On that front, I know that the White House has been in touch with various governors and local officials to offer assistance in the hardest hit areas. But what can the federal government really do about this situation?
You know, our CDC has been getting good information and data to our partners on the ground. We're helping identify, for example, places where people can get indoors. There are cooling centers that have been funded and supported by the federal government, making sure people have access to things like just bottles of water and masks as they deal with this crisis on the ground. But look, the big responsibility for the federal government is the one that President Biden, Vice President Harris have been out front on, and that is dealing with adaptation and resilience in a big way in the face of the climate crisis. $50 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law to help our communities do just that. And also to make sure we're deploying clean energy, getting the pollution out of the sky as quickly as we can so that we're not continuing down this unsustainable trajectory.
And that's a worthy goal. And yet climate activists would argue that fast tracking the Willow project, the oil project in Alaska, or the Mountain Valley Pipeline, natural gas pipeline in West Virginia would run counter to that goal. Do you agree?
You know, the president has overseen the largest investment in climate in the history of not just this country, but anywhere. We just got data today that we deployed more solar last quarter than ever in the history of the United States. We've got millions of vehicles now hitting the roads that are electric and stamped made in America. We cannot afford to go any bit slower. We must go faster and faster. And that's been the president's focus. At the same time, we've got to absorb the reality that we've got a massive economic system that we need to decarbonize. It's not going to happen overnight, but we are moving with great urgency and alacrity in the right direction under President Biden's leadership.
Well, we'll be hoping for cleaner air, easier to breathe over the weekend. Ali Zaidi, thank you so much for coming in and explaining to us the government response today.
Thanks so much.
The 2024 Republican primary field took shape this week. We're going to be speaking with Texas Democratic Congresswoman Veronica Escobar next. She's also the Biden campaign's co-chair. You're streaming America Decides.
Before God and my family, I'm announcing that I'm running for president of the United States of America.
I intend to seek the Republican nomination for President of the United States in 2024, and I want your support.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was Mike Pence and Chris Christie. They're among the latest Republicans who think they have what it takes to defeat President Biden in 2024. So what does the president's reelection campaign think of this burgeoning GOP field? Texas Democratic Congresswoman Veronica Escobar joins us now. She is also the Biden campaign's 2024 co-chair. Hello, Congresswoman. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So it's been a busy day and week, frankly, on the Republican side of the aisle. You've had several Republicans jump into the race, most notably Chris Christie and Mike Pence. What does a large GOP field mean for the president and his reelection efforts?
You know, it doesn't change the strategy for the president or for the campaign. He's going to continue to do everything he can to uplift the American people, talk about the great work that he's done alongside with Congress, while the Republicans duke it out and figure out who their nominee will be.
Does the Biden campaign assume that former President Trump is going to be the Republican nominee? Is that your working assumption right now?
To be candid, we are not assuming anything. I mean, it's in politics and in campaigns, anything can change. Anything can happen from one day to the next.
How's the Biden campaign handling the candidacy of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is running as a Democrat? What would it take? Under what circumstances would President Biden be willing to debate RFK Jr.?
President Biden is the Democratic nominee. And the DNC, as it has done years and years in campaigns and campaigns before, has endorsed the incumbent. And from our perspective, President Biden is the incumbent. He is the nominee.
Paint a picture for us, if you will, of what the Biden campaign is going to look like this summer. The president hasn't been out on the campaign trail yet. Will we see him on the trail later this summer? Where will we see him?
Nancy, as you all have reported, we've been dealing with a number of issues here on Capitol Hill. Until last week, we were working on averting a catastrophe to our economy with what the House Republicans were trying to do by defaulting on our debt. And thanks to President Biden's great leadership, we averted that crisis. So he's been doing the work of governing and leading our nation both here and abroad. He's going to continue to do that. And I know at some point very soon, he will get out on the campaign trail.
Speaking of that debt deal, the Biden campaign recently began running ads capitalizing on the deal. Why is a deal that cuts spending a good topic for the president and the campaign to be talking about?
What's important for the American people to realize and recognize is the House of Representatives is controlled by Republicans. There was going to have to be a deal cut at some point. And House Republicans, as we saw in their Default on America Act, are intent on basically unraveling all of the gains that the administration has made. The president, through his leadership, was basically able to preserve all of the key components of landmark historic legislation and talk Republicans off the edge from defaulting on our national debt and our obligations. That's a huge win for the American people. And the fact of the matter is, President Biden was able to bring people together to avert more catastrophic cuts that Republicans intended to make.
Switching gears, I want to ask you about a piece of legislation that you have introduced with your Republican colleague, Salazar of Florida. It's called the Dignity Act. It combines border security with some new legal pathways to citizenship. Why do you think that legislation can pass a Republican-controlled House when Republicans are having enough trouble passing Republican pieces of legislation right now?
Nancy, there are Republicans in the House who want to truly address what's happening, not just at our nation's border, but beyond. There are some reasonable moderates that I am trying to work with, chiefly with my colleague, Representative Maria Salazar, who understands that the best way to have a well-managed border is through comprehensive immigration reform combined with border security. We also understand that our nation needs a robust workforce. The business community understands this, and my hope is that those of us who truly want to address the lack of action from Congress, in fact, it's been over 30 years since Congress has passed comprehensive immigration reform, that we know it's our obligation to address what's happening, not just at our nation's borders, but beyond. So I think there's a path there. I'm optimistic about the path there, not just in the House, but in the Senate. And it's our duty to make every attempt to make this happen.
Certainly, there are a lot of Americans who hope that Congress can tackle this issue in a responsible way. Congresswoman Escobar of Texas, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Nancy.
Former Speaker of the House John Boehner is weighing in on what he dislikes most about politics. He spoke with CBS News' Major Garrett for The Takeout about that, along with the 2024 presidential field.
What is at work in American politics that disturbs you most?
Well, I think the polarization of America has resulted in the polarization of the Congress. And this polarization is fed every day by what we see on cable news, what we see on the social media platforms. It's pushing and pulling people into one of two camps, leaving fewer and fewer people in the middle. And this polarization has gotten to the point where, it's nasty. And we got friends you can't even talk to about it. Well, I don't want to talk to anybody about it. People come up to me and want to talk about this issue or that issue. Some lady getting on an airplane over the weekend said, well, are you for Mr. Trump this year or next year? I said, we'll see. And then she went on to ask another question about the Congress. And I thought, I'm a little suspicious of this person because I don't think we're gonna agree on much of anything. I think she was a right-wing nutcase.
So where are you on the idea of Mr. Trump for next year?
I think it's time for the Republican Party to move on, and frankly, I think it's time for Donald Trump to move on.
Well, do you think either of those two things are going to happen?
Hope springs eternal.
I think you're going to want to hear more of that interview. And you can stream new episodes of The Takeout every Sunday at 5 p.m. Eastern. Well, that does it for today. You can stream America Decides Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You've been streaming CBS News. Thanks for watching.